The sand was already hot at 0600 hours, and Staff Sergeant Maria Santos knew it was going to be another scorching day in the Afghan desert. She adjusted her medic pack one more time, checking that every piece of equipment was secure and ready. The other soldiers in her unit were finishing their morning equipment checks, their M4 rifles gleaming in the early morning sun. Maria's weapon was different. Her tools were bandages, morphine, and the determination to bring everyone home alive. "Just the medic," she'd heard them whisper when she first joined Bravo Company 6 months ago. It wasn't said with malice, but with the kind of casual dismissal that came from soldiers who hadn't yet learned the difference between surviving a firefight and surviving one with everyone intact. Maria had heard it all before, in basic training, in medical school, and in every unit she'd served with over her 8 years in the Army. But she'd also learned something those whispers didn't account for. When bullets start flying and blood starts flowing, just the medic becomes the most important person on the battlefield. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Captain Rodriguez called the morning briefing, and the soldiers gathered around the tactical map spread across a makeshift table. The mission was routine, or as routine as anything could be in this corner of Afghanistan. They were to escort a convoy of supplies to Forward Operating Base Delta, about 40 kilometers through what intelligence called low-threat territory. Maria had been in the Army long enough to know that low threat was military speak for, "We hope nothing happens, but bring extra ammunition just in case." The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles, 2 MRAPs carrying supplies and personnel, with Maria's vehicle carrying the bulk of the medical supplies positioned in the middle. It was standard protocol to protect the medic and medical equipment, though Maria often wondered if it wasn't more about protecting the equipment than protecting her. She'd proven herself capable of handling whatever came her way, but military bureaucracy moved slower than battlefield respect. As they loaded into the vehicles, Sergeant Thompson, a grizzled veteran with 2 tours under his belt, caught Maria's attention. "Santos," he called out, "stick close today. Intel's been quiet, and that usually means something's brewing." Thompson had been one of the first in the unit to stop calling her just the medic. That change had come 3 months ago, during an IED attack that left 2 soldiers with severe injuries. Maria had kept them alive during a 2-hour firefight, crawling between cover points to reach the wounded while insurgents tried to pin them down. She'd saved both men that day, and Thompson had been watching. The convoy rolled out at 0800 hours. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction. Maria reviewed her mental checklist of medical supplies: trauma bandages, tourniquets, morphine, IV fluids, chest seals, and her most valuable tool, the satellite phone that could call in a medevac helicopter when ground transportation wasn't fast enough. She'd used that phone 11 times in 6 months, and 11 soldiers were alive because of those calls. The landscape was deceptively peaceful, rolling hills of sand and rock with the occasional cluster of ancient-looking buildings that might have been abandoned for decades or might have been hiding enemy fighters. Maria had learned not to trust the peaceful moments. In Afghanistan, the difference between tranquility and chaos was often measured in milliseconds. Staff Sergeant Williams, the convoy commander, came over the radio with their first checkpoint report. "All stations, this is Overwatch. We have movement on the eastern ridgeline approximately 2 clicks from your position. Proceed with caution and be prepared for contact." Maria's hands automatically went to her medic pack, ensuring everything was secure and easily accessible. This was the moment every medic trained for, but hoped would never come. The moment when just the medic would have to prove she was much more than that.
The radio silence that followed the Overwatch warning was deafening. Every soldier in the convoy knew what movement on the eastern ridgeline meant in this part of Afghanistan. They were being watched, tracked, and most likely targeted. Maria checked her equipment one final time, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that seconds could mean the difference between bringing a soldier home or bringing home a flag. Sergeant Williams' voice cut through the tension. "All vehicles, maintain speed and spacing. Eyes up, weapons ready, but do not engage unless engaged first." It was standard operating procedure, but everyone knew that unless engaged first was often determined by someone else's timeline, not their own. The convoy was halfway through the valley when the first shot rang out. The distinctive crack of an AK-47 echoed off the rock walls, followed immediately by the deeper thump of a rocket-propelled grenade that impacted 20 meters to the right of the lead vehicle. Maria felt her training kick in as adrenaline surged through her system. Not the panicked adrenaline of fear, but the focused intensity of a medic who knew people were about to need her skills. "Contact right! Contact right!" Williams shouted over the radio as automatic weapons fire erupted from multiple positions along the ridgeline. The convoy vehicles immediately began evasive maneuvers, trying to reach cover while returning fire. Maria's vehicle lurched left as their driver, Private Johnson, spotted a cluster of boulders that might provide some protection. The attack had been well planned. The insurgents had chosen their position perfectly. High ground with multiple firing positions and escape routes, attacking at the narrowest part of the valley where the convoy's movement was most restricted. Maria counted at least 6 different muzzle flashes from the ridgeline, suggesting a larger force than intelligence had indicated for this low-threat area. The first casualty call came within 30 seconds of the initial contact. "Medic! Medic to Vehicle 1!" The call every medic both dreaded and was trained to answer. Maria grabbed her aid bag and prepared to move, but Sergeant Thompson's voice stopped her. "Santos, stay put until we can establish a perimeter. You can't help anyone if you get shot crossing open ground." It was sound tactical advice, but it went against every instinct Maria had developed as a medic. Somewhere in Vehicle 1, a soldier was bleeding, possibly dying, while she sat in relative safety. She keyed her radio. "Vehicle 1, this is Santos. What's your status? Can you move the casualty to cover?" The response came back broken and urgent. "Negative, negative. Hernandez took shrapnel to the leg and chest. Heavy bleeding. We're pinned down behind the engine block." Maria made the calculation that every medic learns to make, risk versus necessity. Private Hernandez was 19 years old, from a small town in Texas, and had been sending money home to help his younger sister go to college. More importantly, from a medical standpoint, shrapnel to the chest could mean a punctured lung or damaged heart, injuries that would kill him within minutes without immediate intervention. "Thompson," she called to the sergeant, "I need covering fire to reach Vehicle 1. Thompson looked at her with the expression of a man who'd seen too many good people die trying to be heroes. "Santos, that's 40 meters of open ground with shooters on the high ground. It's suicide." "Hernandez won't last 10 minutes with chest trauma," Maria replied, checking her medical supplies one more time. "And if he dies because I was too scared to do my job, then what's the point of being here?" She didn't wait for permission. Maria had learned that sometimes being just the medic meant making command decisions that commanders weren't willing to make. She burst from cover, sprinting toward Vehicle 1 in a zigzag pattern while bullets kicked up sand around her feet. The 40 meters felt like 40 miles. She could hear the distinctive whistle of bullets passing close to her head, could feel the heat of tracer rounds as they streaked past. Her equipment pack bounced against her back as she ran, but every piece of gear stayed secure. She'd learned the hard way to check and double-check those straps. She reached Vehicle 1 and dove behind the armored hull, just as a burst of automatic fire chewed up the ground where she had been running. Corporal Martinez, the vehicle commander, looked at her with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Santos, you're completely insane, but Hernandez is over here and he's in bad shape." Maria crawled to where Private Hernandez lay behind the front wheel and her heart sank. The shrapnel had indeed hit his chest, and she could see the telltale signs of a pneumothorax, a collapsed lung that would kill him unless she could relieve the pressure immediately. His leg wound was severe but manageable. The chest injury was the immediate threat to his life. "Hernandez," she called to the young soldier, who is conscious but showing signs of shock. "I'm going to take care of you, but I need you to stay with me, okay?" She began working with the efficiency that had earned her respect throughout Bravo Company. Chest seal to address the pneumothorax, pressure bandage for the leg wound, IV line to combat shock and blood loss. All while insurgent fire continued to pin down the convoy and radio chatter filled the airwaves with situation reports and calls for reinforcement. As she worked, she realized this firefight was different from the others she had experienced. The insurgents were better organized, better equipped, and seemed to have intelligence about the convoy's route and timing. This wasn't a random ambush. It was a coordinated attack designed to inflict maximum casualties.
The firefight had been raging for 20 minutes when Maria realized they were in more trouble than anyone had initially understood. The insurgent fire wasn't random or poorly coordinated like most of the attacks she'd experienced. These fighters knew exactly where to place their shots, to keep the convoy pinned down while systematically working to disable the vehicles and pick off the soldiers one by one. Private Hernandez was stable, but he needed immediate evacuation to a field hospital. The chest wound she'd treated would hold for now, but without proper surgical intervention within the next hour, he could still die from internal bleeding or complications. Maria had done everything she could with field medicine, but some injuries required more than bandages and morphine. Vehicle 1 to command, Corporal Martinez called over the radio. We need immediate medevac for serious casualties. Cannot move from current position due to effective enemy fire. The response was not what anyone wanted to hear. Vehicle 1, no medevac assets available for minimum 4 hours due to weather conditions at base. You need to hold position and wait for QRF. 4 hours. Maria looked at Hernandez and knew he didn't have 4 hours. She'd seen enough battlefield injuries to recognize when a soldier was fighting a losing battle against time in biology. The IV fluids were helping with the shock, and the chest seal was maintaining lung function, but internal bleeding was something she couldn't address with field equipment. A new voice came over the radio, calm and professional. This is Apache 77. We have eyes on your position. Count 6 enemy fighters on the eastern ridge, 2 possible vehicles moving to flank your southern position. The arrival of attack helicopter support should have been reassuring, but the pilot's next transmission made Maria's blood run cold. Be advised, we're taking effective ground fire from what appears to be a surface-to-air missile system. We cannot provide close air support at this time and are repositioning to a safe distance. Sergeant Williams came over the radio with barely controlled frustration. Apache 77, we have urgent medical situation. 1 soldier critical, requires immediate evacuation. Roger that, vehicle commander. We're working on it, but those SAMs have us locked down same as you. Maria made a decision that would have terrified her 6 months ago, but now seemed like the only logical option available. She reached for the satellite phone in her medical pack, the emergency communication device that could reach anyone, anywhere in the theater of operations. She'd used it 11 times to call for medical evacuations, but always through proper channels and established procedures. This time, she was going to break protocol. She dialed the emergency frequency for the Combined Air Operations Center, the nerve center that controlled all air assets in the region. When the voice answered, professional and slightly surprised to be receiving a call on this frequency, Maria didn't identify herself by name or unit. This is Medic 77 Alpha, emergency medical situation, need immediate air support for casualty evacuation, grid coordinates. She read off their exact location, then added, 1 critical casualty, chest trauma, internal bleeding probable, will not survive without immediate surgical intervention. The voice on the other end was quiet for a moment, then came back. Medic 77 Alpha, no medical evacuation assets available due to surface-to-air threats in your area. Maria looked at Hernandez, whose breathing was becoming more labored despite the chest seal. She made another decision that went against every regulation in the manual. Operations Center, requesting any available air assets for immediate support. We have confirmed SAM system pinning down ground forces and preventing medical evacuation of critical casualty. Medic 77 Alpha, what is your authority for requesting combat air support? It was a fair question. Maria was a staff sergeant medic, not a forward air controller or anyone authorized to direct combat operations. But Hernandez was dying, and sometimes the rules had to bend to save lives. Operations Center, my authority is 1 19-year-old soldier who's going to die in the next hour if someone doesn't help us, she replied, knowing she was probably ending her military career with that transmission. The radio was silent for nearly a full minute. Around her, the firefight continued with sporadic bursts of automatic weapons fire and the occasional explosion of a rocket-propelled grenade. Sergeant Thompson had moved his squad to better defensive positions, but they were still pinned down and running low on ammunition. Finally, the voice came back over the satellite phone. Medic 77 Alpha, stand by for flash override traffic. Flash override was the highest priority classification in military communications, reserved for messages that could affect national security or save lives in immediate danger. Maria had never heard those words directed at her before. Medic 77 Alpha, Raptor flight is being diverted to your location. 2 F-22s will be on station in 15 minutes. Provide laser designation for target areas when they arrive. Maria's hands shook slightly as she acknowledged the transmission. She'd just convinced someone to send 2 of the most advanced fighter jets in the world to help save one young soldier from Texas. The F-22 Raptor was designed to fight other advanced aircraft and sophisticated ground targets, not to provide close air support for pinned-down ground troops. But sometimes, just the medic had to reach higher than anyone expected, and sometimes the most advanced weapons in the world had to be used to save a single life. In 15 minutes, Maria Santos was about to learn what happened when F-22s broke radio silence at a medic's emergency call.
The next 15 minutes stretched like hours in Maria's mind. She maintained constant monitoring of Hernandez's vital signs while coordinating with the other medics in the convoy to ensure all wounded were receiving appropriate care. The insurgent fire had decreased slightly, but the tactical situation remained critical. The enemy fighters seemed content to maintain their positions and wait, perhaps knowing that time was on their side. Maria's satellite phone crackled to life with a transmission unlike anything she'd ever heard before. Medic 77 Alpha, this is Raptor Lead. 2 F-22s inbound to your location, requesting immediate situation update and target identification. The voice was calm, professional, and carried the quiet confidence that came with flying the most advanced air superiority fighter ever built. Maria realized she was about to coordinate with pilots whose aircraft cost more than most people would earn in several lifetimes, all because she'd refused to let a 19-year-old soldier die in a desert valley. Raptor Lead, this is Medic 77 Alpha, she replied, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. We have one critical casualty requiring immediate evacuation, but convoy is pinned down by approximately 6 to 8 insurgent fighters positioned on eastern ridgeline. Enemy forces are equipped with small arms, RPGs, and confirmed surface-to-air missile system. Copy that, Medic 77 Alpha. Raptor flight has been briefed on the SAM threat. We're going to make this quick and clean. Can you provide coordinates for enemy positions? Maria looked at Sergeant Thompson, who had been listening to the radio conversation with growing amazement. Thompson, she called, I need you to spot targets for the F-22s. Thompson crawled over to their position, his expression showing the same mixture of disbelief and respect that Maria had been seeing more frequently over the past 6 months. Santos, he said quietly, do you realize what you just did? You called in F-22 Raptors. Do you know how many levels of command you just bypassed? I know exactly what I did, Maria replied, checking Hernandez's pulse again. It was getting weaker. And I'll face whatever consequences come from it. But right now, I need you to help me mark targets so these pilots can get us out of here. Thompson nodded and began identifying enemy positions for the incoming aircraft. The F-22s were still several minutes out, but Maria could already hear the change in the insurgents' radio chatter that Sergeant Williams was monitoring on the enemy frequency. Word was spreading quickly that American air support was inbound. Raptor Lead, Maria transmitted. Be advised enemy forces may be attempting to relocate SAM system based on monitored communications. Roger, Medic 77 Alpha. We've got thermal imaging on the area and have identified the SAM site. That's going to be our primary target, then we'll work on the riflemen. The sound of jet engines reached them before the aircraft were visible. F-22s were designed for stealth, but at low altitude and high speed, they couldn't completely mask their presence. The deep, powerful roar of twin F-119 engines announced their arrival like thunder rolling across the desert valley. Raptor Lead has eyes on target area. Medic 77 Alpha, keep your people's heads down. We're going in hot. Maria had called in air support before, but never anything like this. Usually it was Apache helicopters or A-10 Warthogs, aircraft specifically designed for close air support. F-22s were air superiority fighters, built to shoot down other aircraft at ranges measured in dozens of miles. Using them for close air support was like using a Formula One race car to deliver pizza. Technically possible, but not what they were designed for. The first pass was devastating. Maria couldn't see the aircraft clearly, but she could see the effects of their weapons. The suspected SAM site disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris as precision-guided munitions found their target. The secondary explosion suggested they'd hit either stored missiles or fuel, confirming that the intelligence about surface-to-air weapons had been accurate. Raptor 2, SAM site neutralized, moving to secondary targets on the ridgeline. The insurgent fire that had been keeping the convoy pinned down suddenly became sporadic and uncoordinated. Maria could see enemy fighters abandoning their positions and running for whatever cover they could find. F-22s might not have been designed for close air support, but when 20mm cannons and precision missiles started eliminating enemy positions, the psychological effect was immediate and decisive. Medic 77 Alpha, this is Raptor Lead. We've eliminated confirmed SAM system and dispersed enemy forces. The area should be clear for helicopter evacuation. Medvac is being scrambled from Forward Operating Base Charlie. ETA 12 minutes to your location. Maria felt a surge of relief that was quickly tempered by professional concern for her patient. Hernandez was holding on, but 12 more minutes was pushing the limits of what field medicine could accomplish for his injuries. She increased the flow rate on his IV and double-checked the chest seal, knowing that every minute counted now. Raptor Flight, she transmitted, thank you for the support. Outstanding work. Negative thanks required, Medic 77 Alpha. We're just glad we could help get your soldier home. As the F-22s departed the area, Maria realized that something fundamental had changed in how she viewed her role in the army. She was still just the medic, but she'd just proven that sometimes the medic had to be more than just the medic. She'd taken responsibility not just for treating wounded soldiers, but for ensuring they had every possible chance to survive, even if it meant breaking protocol and calling in assets far above her authorization level.
The medevac helicopter appeared on schedule, a UH-60 Blackhawk with the distinctive red crosses that marked it as a medical evacuation aircraft. The pilots had been briefed on the tactical situation and were prepared for a rapid extraction under potentially hostile conditions. Maria had worked with medevac crews dozens of times before, but this time felt different. This time, she'd personally fought through multiple levels of military bureaucracy to make sure help arrived in time. As the helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of sand and rotor wash, Maria and Corporal Martinez carefully carried Hernandez toward the aircraft. The flight medic who met them at the cargo door was a staff sergeant like Maria, someone she'd worked with before during previous evacuations. Santos, the flight medic called over the noise of the rotors. What's his status? Penetrating chest trauma, possible pneumothorax treated with chest seal, severe laceration to left leg with moderate blood loss, IV fluids administered for shock. Maria replied, giving the rapid-fire medical briefing that could save precious minutes once they reached the field hospital. Vitals have been stable for the past 20 minutes, but he's going to need immediate surgical intervention for probable internal bleeding. The flight medic nodded and helped load Hernandez into the helicopter where more advanced medical equipment could monitor his condition during the flight to the surgical facility. As Maria stepped back from the aircraft, Private Hernandez grabbed her arm weakly. Sergeant Santos, he said, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. Thank you. Maria squeezed his hand briefly. Just doing my job, Hernandez. You focus on getting better so you can get back home to that sister of yours. The helicopter lifted off, carrying Hernandez toward the surgical team that would hopefully complete the job Maria had started with field medicine and determination. She watched until the aircraft disappeared over the horizon, then turned back to help with the other wounded soldiers from the convoy. The firefight had resulted in 4 casualties total, Hernandez with the most serious injuries, 2 soldiers with minor shrapnel wounds, and 1 with a concussion from an RPG blast. Maria treated the minor injuries efficiently, but her mind kept returning to the radio conversation she'd had with the Air Operations Center and the F-22 pilots. She'd broken protocol in ways that could potentially end her military career, but she'd also saved lives in ways that textbook procedures couldn't have accomplished. Sergeant Williams approached her as she finished treating the last casualty. Santos, we need to talk about what happened here today. Maria straightened up, expecting the conversation she'd been dreading since she made that first unauthorized call on the satellite phone. Military discipline exists for good reasons, and she'd bypassed several levels of command authority to get the air support they needed. The fact that it had worked didn't necessarily mean that it had been the right thing to do according to Army regulations. "I understand, Sergeant Williams," she replied. "I know I exceeded my authority when I called for air support. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences." Williams held up his hand to stop her. "Santos, you saved lives today. Not just Hernandez, but potentially all of us. That SAM system could have taken down the medevac helicopter, and those insurgents had us pinned down with no way out. What you did took initiative, courage, and exactly the kind of thinking we need from our NCOs." Maria was quiet for a moment, processing what she was hearing. In her experience, military leadership didn't usually praise soldiers for breaking the chain of command, even when the results were successful. "However," Williams continued, "there are going to be some questions from higher up about how a staff sergeant medic managed to redirect F-22 Raptors from their original mission. The good news is that everyone came home alive. The potentially complicated news is that you're probably going to be having some conversations with people who have a lot more rank than either of us." The convoy resumed movement toward forward operating base Delta, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The soldiers who had once referred to Maria as just the medic now looked at her with something approaching awe. Word had already spread through the unit about how she'd called in F-22 support and coordinated the airstrike that broke the ambush. Private Johnson, the driver of Maria's vehicle, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "Sergeant Santos, I've been in the Army for 4 years and I've never seen anyone call down Raptors for close air support. That was incredible." "It was necessary," Maria replied, uncomfortable with the attention. "Hernandez was dying and we had no options. Sometimes you have to make the hard calls, even if they're above your pay grade." Sergeant Thompson, who had been quiet since the airstrike, finally spoke up. "Santos, what you did today is going to be talked about for years. You just proved that leadership isn't about rank, it's about taking responsibility when lives are on the line." The remainder of the convoy journey passed without incident, but Maria spent the time thinking about what Thompson had said. She joined the Army to help people, to be the person who brought soldiers home safely to their families. Today, she'd done exactly that, but in ways she'd never imagined when she first put on the uniform 8 years ago. As forward operating base Delta came into view, Maria realized that her military career was about to change dramatically. She'd either be commended for exceptional initiative under combat conditions, or she'd be facing disciplinary action for exceeding her authority. Either way, she'd never again be just the medic to the soldiers she served with.
Forward operating base Delta was buzzing with activity when the convoy arrived. Word had already reached the base about the ambush and the unusual air support that had been called in to resolve it. Maria could see personnel gathering near the entrance, including several officers whose rank insignia suggested they were there specifically to debrief the convoy members about what had transpired. Colonel Patricia Henderson, the base commander, was waiting as Maria's vehicle pulled to a stop. Colonel Henderson had a reputation as a no-nonsense officer who had risen through the ranks based on competence and leadership rather than politics. She was also one of the few senior officers Maria had encountered who seemed to genuinely understand the challenges faced by medics in combat situations. "Staff Sergeant Santos?" Colonel Henderson called as Maria exited her vehicle. "I need to speak with you immediately. My office, 5 minutes." Maria gathered her equipment and followed the colonel, aware that every eye on the base seemed to be watching her. In military culture, being summoned to the commanding officer's office immediately upon return from a mission was rarely a good sign. She mentally prepared herself for what could be a career-ending conversation. Colonel Henderson's office was spartanly furnished, but efficient, with maps of the operational area covering one wall and commendations from her own distinguished career displayed on another. She gestured for Maria to take a seat across from her desk, then got straight to the point. "Santos, I've received some very interesting phone calls about your activities during today's mission. The Air Operations Center wants to know how a staff sergeant medic managed to redirect 2 F-22 Raptors from their original assignment. The pilots from Raptor Flight have submitted a report praising your coordination under fire. And I have a 19-year-old soldier who's going to survive because someone had the initiative to make the hard calls when his life was on the line." Maria straightened in her chair. "Ma'am, I understand that I exceeded my authority when I called for air support. I was prepared to accept responsibility for—" Colonel Henderson raised her hand to stop the explanation. "Santos, let me tell you what I see in these reports. I see a non-commissioned officer who assessed a tactical situation, determined that conventional procedures were insufficient to save lives, and took initiative to find solutions outside normal channels. I see someone who convinced air operations to divert extremely valuable assets based solely on the urgency and clarity of her assessment. And I see results. Everyone came home alive." Maria wasn't sure how to respond. In her experience, military discipline was usually more concerned with following procedures than with achieving results, even when those results saved lives. "However," the colonel continued, "there are proper channels for requesting air support, and those channels exist for very good reasons. What happens if every medic in the field decides they have the authority to redirect combat aircraft? What happens to command and control if junior NCOs start making tactical decisions based on their individual assessment of situations?" It was a fair question, and Maria had been thinking about it during the convoy ride back to base. Military discipline and chain of command weren't just bureaucratic obstacles. They were systems designed to coordinate complex operations involving thousands of personnel and millions of dollars in equipment. "Ma'am," Maria replied carefully, "I understand the importance of following proper procedures, but in that situation, proper procedures would have resulted in the death of at least one soldier, and possibly more if the insurgents had been able to use that SAM system against the medevac helicopter. Sometimes the mission requires adapting to circumstances that weren't covered in the standard operating procedures." Colonel Henderson leaned back in her chair, studying Maria with the expression of an officer who had made similar difficult decisions during her own career. "Santos, what would you do if you were in my position? How do I balance the need for discipline and proper procedures with the need to encourage the kind of initiative you showed today?" It was an unusual question for a colonel to ask a staff sergeant, but Maria sensed that her answer was important not just for her own career, but for how the Army would handle similar situations in the future. "Ma'am, I think the key is intent. I didn't call for air support because I wanted to exceed my authority or because I thought I knew better than my superiors. I called for air support because a soldier was dying and conventional options weren't available. If my intent had been to showboat or to prove something, that would be a disciplinary issue. But if my intent was to accomplish the mission, which is to bring everyone home alive, then maybe the focus should be on improving procedures rather than punishing initiative." Colonel Henderson nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say, Santos, because as of today, you're being reassigned to the operations planning staff here at Delta. We need people who can think outside conventional parameters when lives are on the line, and we need those people helping to write the procedures that other soldiers will follow in similar situations." Maria was stunned. Instead of facing disciplinary action, she was being promoted to a position where she could help ensure that other medics wouldn't have to choose between following procedures and saving lives. "Ma'am, I'm honored by the assignment, but I need to ask, what about my duties as a field medic? That's what I trained for, and that's where I feel I can make the most difference." Colonel Henderson smiled. "Santos, today you proved that being a medic is about more than treating wounds. It's about ensuring that wounded soldiers get every possible chance to survive and go home to their families. Your new assignment will let you do that for a lot more soldiers than you could reach with one medical kit." As Maria left the colonel's office, she realized that her military career had taken a turn she'd never anticipated. She was no longer just the medic. She was now the medic who could help shape how the Army approached battlefield medicine and emergency procedures.
3 weeks after the ambush in the valley, Maria found herself in a conference room she'd never imagined she'd see, the Pentagon's Operations Planning Center. The walls were lined with screens displaying real-time information from military operations around the world. And the people seated around the massive conference table included generals, admirals, and senior civilian officials whose decisions affected thousands of service members deployed across the globe. Maria was the lowest-ranking person in the room by several pay grades, but she was there because her actions had highlighted critical gaps in military medical evacuation procedures. The official reason for her presence was to provide field perspective on emergency medical protocols, but she suspected the real reason was that someone wanted to understand how a staff sergeant had managed to redirect two of the Air Force's most valuable aircraft without going through proper channels. General Patricia Morrison, the Army's Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, called the meeting to order. Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today to discuss what's being called the Delta Valley Incident and its implications for our emergency medical procedures. Staff Sergeant Santos, would you please walk us through your decision-making process during the events of September 3rd? Maria stood and moved to the front of the room, acutely aware that she was addressing some of the most senior military leadership in the country. She'd rehearsed this briefing dozens of times, but standing in front of these officers was more intimidating than facing insurgent fire in Afghanistan. Ma'am, the situation began as a routine convoy escort mission, Maria began, using the presentation slides that had been prepared by the operations planning staff. However, the enemy force was larger and better equipped than intelligence had indicated, including surface-to-air missiles that prevented standard medevac procedures. She walked through the timeline of events, explaining how conventional procedures would have resulted in at least one fatality and possibly more if the SAM system had engaged incoming medical evacuation aircraft. When she reached the point where she'd called the Air Operations Center directly, several officers exchanged glances that suggested this was the part of the story they found most concerning. Staff Sergeant Santos, interrupted Admiral James Parker from the Joint Chiefs of Staff, at what point did you decide you had the authority to request F-22 support? It was the question Maria had been expecting and dreading. Sir, I didn't think I had the authority. I knew I was exceeding my authorized responsibilities, but Private Hernandez was dying, and no authorized assets were available to save his life. I made the decision that saving a soldier's life was more important than following proper procedures. The room was quiet for several seconds. In military culture, publicly stating that you deliberately violated procedures was career suicide, regardless of the results. But Maria had decided weeks ago that honesty was the only approach that would help improve the system for future soldiers. Colonel Sarah Chen, who had been taking notes throughout the presentation, looked up from her papers. Sergeant Santos, walk us through what would have happened if you'd followed standard procedures. Ma'am, standard procedures required requesting medevac through proper channels, waiting for authorization, and accepting whatever timeline was provided by higher command. In this case, that timeline was 4 hours due to weather conditions at the nearest base. Private Hernandez would have died within 1 hour without surgical intervention. And the alternative procedures you used, Colonel Chen continued? I used the emergency medical communication system to contact air operations directly, identified myself as responsible for a critical casualty, and requested any available assets for immediate support. The response was the diversion of F-22 aircraft that eliminated the SAM threat and allowed standard medevac procedures to proceed. General Morrison leaned forward in her chair. Sergeant Santos, what you did in Afghanistan worked in this specific situation, but what are the broader implications? What happens if every medic in theater decides they can call in air support whenever they think it's necessary? It was the core issue that had brought her to the Pentagon. Maria had thought about this question extensively during her preparation for this briefing, and she had an answer that she hoped would be constructive rather than defensive. Ma'am, I think the issue isn't whether medics should have the authority to call in air support. The issue is that our current emergency medical procedures don't account for situations where conventional assets aren't available, but alternative assets are. In this case, F-22 aircraft were available and capable of resolving the tactical situation, but our procedures didn't provide any mechanism for accessing those assets.
She clicked to her final slide, which contained her recommendations for procedural changes. I believe we need emergency protocols that allow medical personnel to access any available assets when lives are in immediate danger, with appropriate oversight and accountability measures. The discussion that followed lasted for 2 hours, with officers from different branches debating the balance between maintaining command structure and providing medics with the tools they needed to save lives. Maria answered questions about everything from communication procedures to the psychological stress of making life and death decisions under fire. When the meeting concluded, General Morrison approached Maria personally. "Sergeant Santos, your actions in Afghanistan showed exactly the kind of initiative and leadership we need from our non-commissioned officers. But more importantly, your analysis of the systemic issues has given us a roadmap for improving our procedures." Maria felt a sense of relief that she hadn't expected. For weeks, she'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for someone to decide that her actions had been inappropriate regardless of the results. Instead, she was being told that her experience would help improve the system for other soldiers. "Ma'am, I just want to make sure that other medics don't have to choose between following procedures and saving lives. Every soldier deserves every possible chance to make it home."
6 months after the Pentagon briefing, Maria found herself back in Afghanistan, but her role had changed dramatically. She was now part of a pilot program called Adaptive Medical Response, designed to test new emergency procedures that gave field medics expanded authority to access available assets during life-threatening situations. The program was the direct result of recommendations that had emerged from the Delta Valley incident and subsequent policy reviews. Maria's new position was officially titled Senior Medical Coordinator, which meant she was responsible not only for treating wounded soldiers, but also for training other medics in the new procedures and serving as a liaison between medical personnel and air support assets. It was a role that required her to be more than just the medic on a full-time basis. The training program she'd developed was being implemented across multiple forward operating bases, teaching medics how to properly assess situations where conventional procedures might be insufficient and how to access alternative support through proper but expedited channels. The goal was to provide medics with more options while maintaining the command structure and accountability that made military operations possible. Lieutenant Colonel David Walsh, the medical officer overseeing the pilot program, had become both Maria's immediate supervisor and her strongest advocate for the new procedures. He'd seen too many cases where soldiers had died waiting for help that was technically available but procedurally inaccessible. "Santos," he said during one of their weekly briefings, "the early results from the pilot program are encouraging. Medics are reporting increased confidence in their ability to save lives, and we haven't had any incidents of inappropriate use of the expanded authorities." Maria reviewed the statistics on her tablet. "Sir, I think the key has been the training emphasis on documentation and justification. Medics understand that they'll need to explain their decisions, so they're making sure those decisions are based on genuine medical necessity, rather than convenience." The new procedures weren't dramatically different from what Maria had done during the Delta Valley incident, but they provided a framework that made such actions part of established protocol, rather than violations of it. Medics could now access a medical emergency override that allowed them to request any available assets for life-threatening situations, provided they could document the medical necessity and lack of conventional alternatives. The system had been tested several times over the past 6 months, with results that validated Maria's original assessment. In one case, a medic had been able to access Navy helicopter support for a soldier with severe burns when Army medevac assets were committed to other missions. In another, Air Force cargo aircraft had been diverted to evacuate multiple casualties from a remote outpost where ground transportation wasn't feasible. Perhaps more importantly, the new procedures had changed the culture around emergency medical decision-making. Medics no longer felt like they had to choose between following regulations and saving lives. They had a path that allowed them to do both. Maria's current assignment had brought her back to the same region where the Delta Valley incident had occurred, but she was now working with multiple units across a wider area. Her reputation had preceded her, and soldiers throughout the region knew her as the medic who had called in F-22s to save a soldier's life.
It was a reputation that opened doors and encouraged other medics to think creatively about solving problems. Sergeant First Class Michael Torres, one of the medics Maria was training in the new procedures, approached her after a particularly challenging exercise. "Sergeant Santos," he said, "I have to ask, were you scared when you made that call to the Air Operations Center? I mean, you had to know you were taking a huge risk with your career." Maria considered the question carefully. It wasn't the first time someone had asked about her state of mind during the Delta Valley incident, and she'd learned that her answer was important for medics who might face similar decisions in the future. "Torres," she replied, "I was terrified. Not because I was worried about my career, but because I knew that if I made the wrong call, Hernandez would die. The career concerns didn't even occur to me until after the helicopters had taken him away. When you're responsible for someone's life, everything else becomes secondary." Torres nodded thoughtfully. "That's what I figured. I think that's why the new procedures work. They're designed by people who understand that medical decisions have to be based on medical priorities, not administrative convenience." Maria's satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from the Regional Medical Command. Reading it, she felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that came with emergency notifications. A convoy about 30 kilometers to the south had been hit by an IED, with multiple casualties, including at least one soldier with critical injuries. "Torres," she called, gathering her equipment, "we're about to see the new procedures in action. We've got a real-world emergency, and we're going to show you how the system is supposed to work when lives are on the line." As they prepared to respond to the emergency, Maria reflected on how much had changed since that day in the valley. She was still a medic, still responsible for bringing soldiers home alive, but now she had the tools and authority to do whatever was necessary to accomplish that mission. The phrase, "just the medic," had taken on a completely different meaning. It now represented someone who would stop at nothing to save lives, regardless of conventional limitations. The helicopter was warming up outside, ready to take them to another emergency where Maria's training, experience, and hard-won authority would be put to the test once again.
The emergency call had come from Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, the same unit that had been in the Delta Valley 6 months earlier. Sergeant Thompson's voice over the radio brought back immediate memories of that day, but this time the situation was different. This time, Maria had official authority to coordinate whatever resources were necessary to save lives. "Medical Coordinator Santos, this is Thompson," the transmission began. "We've got a complex IED explosion with 4 casualties, 1 urgent surgical, 2 priorities, 1 walking wounded. The urgent surgical is Corporal Martinez. You remember him from the valley." Maria did remember Martinez. He'd been the vehicle commander who had helped her reach Hernandez during the firefight. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now responding to save the man who had helped her save someone else 6 months ago. "Thompson, this is Santos. What's Martinez's condition?" she asked, as the helicopter lifted off from Forward Operating Base Delta. "Blast trauma to the lower extremities, possible internal injuries, conscious but showing signs of shock. We've got him stabilized for now, but you know how these things go." Maria knew exactly how these things went. IED explosions caused complex injuries that often looked manageable initially, but could deteriorate rapidly without proper intervention. The blast effects on internal organs were particularly unpredictable, and field medicine could only do so much to address them. "Thompson, I need you to establish a landing zone and prepare for immediate evacuation. What's your current tactical situation?" "Area is secure, no enemy contact since the explosion. We've got good perimeter security and clear skies for helicopter operations." It was a relief to hear that this emergency wouldn't involve the tactical complications that had made the Delta Valley incident so challenging. But Maria knew that medical emergencies were plenty complicated, even without enemy fire to worry about. As the helicopter approached the incident site, Maria could see the aftermath of the IED explosion. The lead vehicle on the convoy had been destroyed, and debris was scattered across a wide area. The soldiers had established an effective casualty collection point about 100 meters from the blast site, following the procedures that had been refined over years of combat operations. Maria jumped from the helicopter while the rotors were still turning and ran toward the casualty collection point. Corporal Martinez was lying on a stretcher, conscious, but clearly in pain.
The medic who had been treating him, Specialist Johnson, looked up with relief as Maria approached. "Sergeant Santos," Johnson called over the noise of the helicopter. "I've got him stabilized, but I think we're dealing with internal bleeding in addition to the obvious extremity injuries. Blood pressure is dropping despite IV fluids." Maria knelt beside Martinez and began her own assessment. Johnson was right. The external injuries were severe but manageable, but the signs of internal bleeding were becoming more pronounced. This was exactly the kind of case where rapid evacuation could mean the difference between life and death. "Martinez," Maria called to the wounded soldier, "how are you feeling?" "Been better, Sergeant Santos. Guess it's my turn to need the medic who calls in fighter jets." Maria smiled, despite the seriousness of the situation. Martinez's sense of humor was intact, which was a good sign for his mental status, but his physical condition was clearly deteriorating. She made the decision to implement the new medical emergency override procedures. Using her satellite phone, she contacted the Regional Medical Command Center. "Medical Command, this is Medical Coordinator Santos. I'm implementing medical emergency override for immediate surgical evacuation. One critical casualty with suspected internal bleeding requiring immediate surgical intervention." The response came back within 30 seconds. "Medical Coordinator Santos, medical emergency override approved. Surgical evacuation helicopter inbound to your location, ETA 8 minutes. Forward surgical team is being alerted at Regional Medical Center." It was a dramatic contrast to the 4-hour wait time that had been quoted during the Delta Valley incident. The new procedures had created a system where life-threatening emergencies could access priority support through streamlined channels without requiring medics to bypass the chain of command entirely. While they waited for the surgical evacuation helicopter, Maria coordinated treatment for the other casualties. The 2 priority cases had been handled effectively by the unit's medics, and the walking wounded soldier needed only basic first aid. It was the kind of medical response that demonstrated how much the capabilities of field medics had improved over years of combat experience. The surgical helicopter arrived exactly on schedule, carrying a surgeon, flight surgeon, and advanced life support equipment that could maintain Martinez's condition during transport to the regional medical facility. As Maria helped transfer him to the aircraft, she reflected on how different this emergency had been from the one 6 months ago. "Sergeant Santos," Martinez called as they loaded him into the helicopter, "thanks for not having to call in the Air Force this time. Just doing my job, Martinez, but I've got F-22s on speed dial if we need them." As the helicopter departed with Martinez, Maria turned her attention to completing the medical documentation required by the new procedures. The medical emergency override system required detailed justification for any non-standard use of resources, but the paperwork was manageable and the accountability measures were reasonable. Sergeant Thompson approached her as she finished the documentation. "Santos," he said, "it's good to have you back in the field. The new procedures you developed are making a real difference. We all feel like we have better options when things go wrong." Maria looked around at the soldiers who were cleaning up from the incident, knowing that they would all be going home safely because the military medical system had evolved to give medics the tools they needed to save lives effectively. It had taken a crisis in a desert valley to identify the problems, but the solutions were working exactly as intended.
2 years after the Delta Valley incident, Maria found herself standing in the Rose Garden of the White House, wearing her dress blue uniform with new rank insignia that reflected her promotion to Sergeant First Class. The ceremony was recognizing military personnel who had demonstrated exceptional initiative and leadership in developing new operational procedures, and Maria was one of 12 service members being honored for contributions that had improved military effectiveness and saved lives. President Rebecca Martinez, no relation to the Corporal Martinez that Maria had helped save, was personally presenting the awards. The president had a background in military affairs and understood the significance of the procedural changes that had emerged from Maria's actions in Afghanistan. "Sergeant First Class Santos," the president said, as Maria stepped forward to receive the Distinguished Service Medal, "your actions during the Delta Valley incident demonstrated the kind of initiative and leadership that represents the best of our military. But more importantly, your subsequent work to improve our emergency medical procedures has saved countless lives and made our forces more effective in protecting American interests around the world. Maria accepted the medal with the same mixture of pride and humility that had characterized her approach to military service since she'd first enlisted 9 years ago. The recognition was meaningful, but what mattered most to her was knowing that medics serving in combat zones now had better tools and procedures for saving lives. The ceremony concluded with a reception where Maria had the opportunity to meet with other service members who had been recognized for their contributions to military innovation. She was particularly interested in talking with Staff Sergeant David Chen, an Air Force communications specialist who had developed new procedures for coordinating between different service branches during joint operations. Sergeant Santos, Chen said during their conversation, "I've heard about your work with the Adaptive Medical Response Program. The coordination procedures you developed have been adapted for use in other areas where we need rapid response to emergency situations." Maria was pleased to learn that the principles behind the medical emergency procedures were being applied more broadly. The core concept, providing frontline personnel with streamlined access to whatever resources were necessary to accomplish critical missions, had applications beyond battlefield medicine. As the reception continued, Maria was approached by a Colonel Sarah Henderson, who had been her commanding officer at Forward Operating Base Delta and was now working at the Pentagon on military medical policy. "Santos," Colonel Henderson said, "I wanted to let you know that the Adaptive Medical Response Program is being expanded to all theaters of operation. The procedures you developed are becoming standard practice throughout the military medical system." It was the kind of institutional change that Maria had hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. When she'd made that unauthorized call to the Air Operations Center 2 years ago, she'd been focused entirely on saving Private Hernandez's life. She hadn't imagined that her actions would lead to systematic improvements in how the military approached emergency medical situations. "Ma'am, I'm honored to have contributed to improvements that will help other medics save lives. That's what this has always been about, making sure that soldiers have every possible chance to make it home to their families." Colonel Henderson nodded. "Santos, that's exactly why the program has been so successful. It wasn't developed by people trying to fix theoretical problems. It was developed by someone who had actually faced the impossible choice between following procedures and saving lives. That real-world perspective made all the difference." As Maria prepared to leave the reception, she was approached by a young soldier she didn't recognize. The soldier introduced herself as Private First Class Lisa Rodriguez, a medic who was about to deploy to Afghanistan for her first combat assignment. "Sergeant Santos," Rodriguez said, "I just wanted to thank you for the new procedures. During our training, our instructors told us about what you did in the Delta Valley and how it led to changes that give us more options for helping wounded soldiers. It means a lot to know that someone fought to make sure we have the tools we need to do our jobs effectively." Maria looked at the young medic and saw herself 9 years ago, eager to serve, determined to make a difference, and probably underestimating how challenging and rewarding military service could be. "Rodriguez, the most important thing I can tell you is to remember that being a medic means being responsible for bringing everyone home alive. Sometimes that means following procedures, and sometimes that means having the courage to adapt when procedures aren't sufficient. Trust your training, trust your instincts, and never forget that every soldier you treat has people at home who are counting on you to take care of them." As Maria left the White House and returned to her current assignment at Walter Reed Medical Center, where she was now working on the next generation of battlefield medical procedures, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that day in the Afghan desert. She was no longer serving as a field medic, but her work was still focused on ensuring that medics in the field had everything they needed to save lives. The phrase,
just the medic, had evolved to represent something far more significant than anyone had originally understood. It now represented the idea that medical personnel were not just supporters of military operations, but integral leaders whose decisions could affect the success of entire missions. Maria had proven that medics could be trusted with expanded authority and responsibility, and the military had responded by giving medics the tools they needed to use that authority effectively. Most importantly, soldiers like Private Hernandez and Corporal Martinez are alive and home with their families because someone was willing to challenge the assumption that procedures were more important than lives.
5 years after the Delta Valley incident, Maria stood in front of a lecture hall filled with new Army medics at Fort Sam Houston, the military's primary medical training facility. Her rank had advanced to Master Sergeant, and her role had evolved into something she'd never anticipated when she first enlisted. She was now the senior instructor for the Advanced Combat Medical Leadership course, responsible for training the next generation of military medics in both traditional medical skills and the leadership capabilities that modern battlefield medicine required. The students in front of her represented the future of military medicine. They came from diverse backgrounds, but they all shared the same fundamental commitment that had driven Maria throughout her career: the determination to bring every soldier home alive. What was different now was that they would be entering service with procedures and authorities that Maria had helped develop through years of real-world experience and institutional change. Ladies and gentlemen, Maria began her lecture, today we're going to discuss what happens when standard procedures aren't sufficient to save lives, and how you determine when it's appropriate to seek alternative solutions. This isn't about encouraging you to ignore regulations, it's about teaching you to think critically about how to accomplish your mission when conventional approaches aren't working. She clicked to her first slide, which showed a map of the Afghan valley where her story had begun. 5 years ago, I was a staff sergeant medic who found herself in a situation where following standard procedures would have resulted in the death of a 19-year-old soldier. The decisions I made that day led to changes in how our military approaches emergency medical situations, but more importantly, they illustrated principles that every medic needs to understand about leadership and responsibility. Maria walked through the Delta Valley incident step by step, explaining not just what had happened, but why each decision had been made and what alternatives had been considered. She emphasized the medical reasoning behind her actions, the risk assessment that had led her to seek F-22 support, and the documentation and accountability measures that had made her actions defensible, even though they'd exceeded her official authority. The key point, she continued, is that leadership isn't about rank or official authority. It's about taking responsibility for outcomes when lives are at stake. As medics, you have a unique role in military operations because your primary mission is always the same: preserve life and enable soldiers to continue fighting or return home safely. One of the students, a young woman who reminded Maria of herself at that age, raised her hand. Master Sergeant Santos, how do you know when it's appropriate to exceed your authority? What if you make the wrong call and someone gets hurt because you didn't follow procedures? It was a question Maria encountered in every class, and it was the most important question for new medics to understand. That's the right question to ask, because it shows you understand that these decisions have consequences. The answer is that you make the best decision you can based on your training, the information available to you, and your assessment of what will save the most lives. You document your reasoning, you accept responsibility for the outcome, and you learn from the results. She clicked to her next slide, which showed statistics from the 5 years since the new medical emergency override procedures had been implemented. Since these procedures were established, military medics have used emergency override authorities 847 times. In every case, the medic was able to document medical necessity and justify their decisions. The result has been a 23% improvement in survival rates for critical battlefield injuries and 0 cases of inappropriate use of override authorities. Another student asked, Master Sergeant Santos, what happened to Private Hernandez, the soldier you saved in the Delta Valley? Maria smiled. It was a question she loved answering. Hernandez recovered fully from his injuries and completed his deployment. He's now a civilian working as a paramedic in San Antonio, and he recently got married. His sister, who he was sending money to for college, graduated with a degree in engineering and is now designing medical equipment for military applications. Sometimes saving one life creates ripple effects that continue to benefit others for years to come. As the class continued, Maria shared stories from other medics who had used the new procedures to save lives in situations where conventional protocols would have been insufficient. Each story reinforced the same basic principle, that medics who understood their responsibilities and had the proper tools could make decisions that significantly improved outcomes for wounded soldiers. The lecture concluded with Maria's fundamental message to new medics. You are not just the medic. You are a leader whose decisions can affect the success of entire operations and the lives of everyone you serve with. The military has given you expanded authorities and better procedures because they trust you to use them wisely. Live up to that trust, and remember that every decision you make is ultimately about helping someone's son or daughter come home safely. After class, several students approached Maria with additional questions about leadership, decision-making under pressure, and career development as a military medic. She encouraged each of them to think beyond the technical aspects of medical training and consider how their role as medics connected to the broader mission of military service. As Maria packed up her materials and prepared for her next class, this one for senior medical officers on implementing adaptive emergency procedures, she reflected on how much both she and the military medical system had evolved since that day in the Afghan desert. The scared young medic who had exceeded her authority to save a soldier's life had become a senior leader responsible for training hundreds of medics and shaping policy that affected thousands of soldiers. But at its core, her mission remained the same, ensuring that military medics had everything they needed to bring soldiers home alive. The tools had improved, the procedures had evolved, and the authority had been formalized, but the fundamental responsibility remained unchanged. Maria's story had begun with someone calling her just the medic, but it had evolved into something much more significant. She had proven that medics could be trusted with real leadership responsibilities, and the military had responded by creating systems that recognized and supported that leadership. Most importantly, soldiers are alive today because someone was willing to challenge the assumption that following procedures was more important than saving lives. The lesson she hoped every new medic would learn was simple. When you're responsible for someone's life, there's no such thing as just the medic. There's only the medic who will do whatever it takes to bring everyone home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.